Obviously, the divine is a broad concept. It's embedded within kind of the Abrahamic tradition. So divine, I'm saying it in the broadest sense. So it could mean God, gods, spirits, the soul, any kind of conception of kind of godlike entities. So the divine is very broad kind of stroke kind of term. So it can describe as well the supernatural. So okay, let's make a start then. So this week we're going to be exploring the devil. And ultimately, the devil as a figure manifests across different cultures, societies, tribes. We're going to obviously focus on some aspects of the Abrahamic development of the Satan character. Now, we've been talking for many weeks about how, if we look at the formation, or especially the earliest formation of religion and the supernatural, it was grounded in utility, right? So the need for a farmer to worship some kind of fertility or sun god was based on their particular need. So it's based on their specific utility. So there was a function behind it. So what is the function then? What is the need of creating this devil type entity? So in essence, what we want to look at is this topic. We want to kind of explore why human beings needed to personify evil, perhaps in physical form. Now, to do that, we are going to run through some kind of key concepts that will build us to looking at the devil. So it should make sense. So the first key concept that we want to build is this idea of a social construct. I think I've been using the term quite a lot, since the start. I've kind of said, the supernatural is a social construct. Religion is a social construct. The gods is a social construct. But we really need to try to understand what we mean by that. So a dictionary-based definition suggests a social construct is an idea that has been created and accepted by the people in a society. What does that mean? What is a social construct? In simple terms. How would we define it? How would we describe it? So in its absolute simplest sense, a social construct can be an idea, an object, a thing, a category. But importantly, what happens is that we as a society make that thing or idea real. So it's not something that's inherent within nature, it's something that we construct. So we take like an idea, we as humans construct it and make it real. Now, how do we make it real? How do we make this idea, this object, real?
Give it meaning.
So we give it meaning, importantly, and ultimately it's based on collective agreement. So in essence, we conceive the idea. It's a social construct in the sense that human beings create it. It's not something inherent within nature. It becomes real through this idea of collective agreement, and over time, what happens? It becomes taken for granted. It can become part of our culture. So if we look at some examples, say for example race, and we're looking at money and the devil. So we might suggest that these are examples of a social construct. How is race a social construct? Any ideas on how race is a social construct?
The acceptance that people live together.
Okay, so there is an element of that. So if you look at it actually historically, obviously historically, we as a society started to basically construct boundaries of separation based upon alleged biological kind of differences. And so we started to use that then to kind of create characteristics, that certain people have certain characteristics and attributes based on their racial disposition. In fact, as we know, if we look at it, skin pigmentation, for example, there is no singular skin pigmentation that is the same. Meaning all of us, we all have completely different skin pigmentation. So trying to draw a correlation between race is problematic. And often what we've found historically is that the creation of social boundaries like race have a tendency to be built upon a power imbalance. So when they started to kind of create this racial categorization, it was kind of linked to this idea that basically the less white you were, the more kind of irrational, savage, backward you were. So they're trying to draw connections to race. But race in its origin is just a social construct. It's something we as a society created. Money is another example. Now, if I go to the supermarket, buy some goods, I pay money. Isn't that real? How is that a social construct? Yeah.
Well, it's really just like, money's just kind of an IOU for goods and services paid for.
So based on, the monetary system, right?
The value we place on it.
So it's the value we place on it. In essence, all money is, it's paper, right? And what we've done is imbue it with value, its worth. We've created collectively, we've made that thing real. That paper, we've given it realness through collective agreement, and hence we are the ones that imbue it with value, with worth, and that becomes a collective agreement. And ultimately, it's something that we just take for granted. It's a given that money is what we use for exchange. But in essence, it is just a social construct. What about the monarchy? Is that a social construct? So it exists, again, with our agreement. There's multiple things. Marriage is a social construct because there are different rules and rituals. Obviously, some societies don't have this idea of marriage. So again, it's a social construct, So it's important to understand that a social construct is something that we as human beings create. So it doesn't exist inherently within nature. And we, through collective agreement, make it real. And it becomes tangible as a result of that. So the devil is a social construct. How? Because the devil is not an objective reality. It's not something that we can prove empirically. It's not something that is physical. It has been something that we have created. So it's again something that we made real and gave physical form to represent the bad, the evil. Now, another important aspect of social construct is the idea of creating a distinction between the social and the natural. So we said a social construct is something inherent in human society that we create. It's not part of nature. So in essence, it does not represent objective reality. So following that, what about something like gravity then? Is gravity a social construct? So probably not, Why is gravity not basically a social construct? Is because it exists independently of human beings. So if there were no human beings here, gravity still exists. So when there was the dinosaurs, gravity still existed. So gravity is part of the physical universe. It's embedded within the natural law. So gravity is not a social construct, So Newton or whatever might have discovered it, but in essence it always existed. So we need to make a distinction between things that humans construct and things that are inherent within nature that are not basically social constructions. Another one, what about personality? Is that a social construct? How would we view personality? Yep.
I suppose it depends how you define it. You could take the root of heritable traits and things and say that is your personality. As a broader concept of how somebody behaves and define it with the category of personality, you could say it's a social creature.
So it is a bit of a grey one, because obviously personality is not a physical thing. It's a theory of human behavior. It's kind of, psychologists have asserted certain traits and personality traits that define behavior. So they'll suggest maybe someone is inherently perhaps introverted, while someone might be extroverted. For sociologists, we're going to say that obviously personality is a social construct because society makes the human agent. We are crafted from our socialization. It's nature that kind of defines us. Our experiences, interactions, that shapes our actions and behavior. But it really depends on how you define personality. If you say there are inherent traits embedded within us in part of nature, then it becomes a bit of a grey one. But for now, all we want to do is create a very clear line of distinction between the social construct within the human realm and the natural aspect. So as long as we have a clear clarity. So okay, now what we're going to do, we're going to look at some other ideas. Just as a little disclaimer, some of the images might be a little bit disturbing, but they are designed to kind of elicit a response. So it's just a kind of trigger warning. Okay, so when we see quite disturbing and shocking images like this, children starving in Africa, what does this image invoke?
Suffering.
So we see suffering, right? What other kind of emotions does it? Sorry? Sadness?
Famine.
Famine? Yep. Empathy. So when we see things like this, unfortunately, this is a reality. There are, as we speak, children starving to death, right? And that will naturally elicit emotional responses within us. So it could be shame, it could be guilt, it could be, anger, that how could such a thing happen in the modern age when we have so much wealth? It could be a sense of helplessness, that what can I do? So in essence, when we see suffering, we have an emotional response. So when we see, unfortunately, children dying and starving, or there's a natural disaster that wipes away people's homes and they're desperate, they have nothing, that inevitably sparks an emotional response within us. Now, why do we have this emotional response in the first place? When we see human suffering, why is there this emotional response?
Because we're human.
So we're human, right? So there is this humanness that is inherent within us. We have this love of species. Generally speaking, we don't want to see our fellow human being suffer. We don't want to see children starving. That's just inherent within us. We have the love of our species. Now, I'm not talking about things like ideology that might erode our humanness. So things like ideology can make us do inhumane things, harm people and so forth. That's the dehumanizing process that comes from ideologies and so forth. We're talking at the instinctual level. When we see other human beings suffer, we have an emotional response based on our humanness. Now, the question is, when we have that emotional response, that trigger of seeing someone suffer, what is the response to it? So we see this, starvation. We see floods and natural disasters. We see all this suffering and pain. How then do we respond to this suffering? Yeah.
Impetus for altruism.
Okay, yes. So there was meant to be, obviously, I don't know where it's disappeared to, but how do we deal with the emotional responses of suffering? We have to engage in a process of sense making. We have to give it meaning. Why is this happening? We need to kind of resolve conflicts that may be happening within us, that when we see these things, we're unhappy. It's naturally going to make us unhappy to see humans suffer. So the process or our response is to make sense of it. This is what early tribes did. When they woke up and perhaps their crops had been decimated by locusts the night before, they encountered a crisis. They need to make sense of it. Why has this happened? So, okay. So sense making is the key. Now, how do we create meaning? So, if we're talking about now, we've encountered crisis, we see these problems, how do we create this sense making? So there are two levels, right? There's the individual level and there's the kind of collective level. At the individual level, this is where we have our own distinct beliefs, values, and ideas, right? This is our world view. It's unique to you because it's based on your experiences, your socialization. So inherently, you have a worldview that is the thing that you use to make sense of the world around you. It's the thing that you interact with. It's the thing that basically provides you that moral kind of compass. So we all have our own particular beliefs, our worldview, that helps us make sense of the world around us. All the bad things, all the things that happen, we have a particular worldview. Now, at the collective level, as a society, because we do not exist in a void, we're part of a collective group, society has shared values, collective kind of values and beliefs, its own kind of worldview. So in the West, for example, a collective kind of agreed value, especially in Britain, is the idea of self-autonomy, right? That every human being has the inherent right to choose the good. You know, they can pick whatever sexual orientation they want. They have the freedom and the self-agency to choose between what they feel is the good, right? So that is something that is considered a collective worldview of our society that we're embedded with. This idea of agency, which can form our kind of collective culture, if you will. Now, what's the problem with all of this? So the collective culture, the collective ideals that we hold, the problem is that they are situational. What do we mean by that? That the values we hold collectively and individually are situational. Yep.
The collective values that you have are dependent on luck, maybe, or where you're situated in the world.
So situational is the sense, I would agree with you, these values are not fixed. They're not bound to a specific time, place, or person. So what happens, and why we define them as situational, they can change based on our experiences, based on the different changes that occur, time and place. So for example, I don't know, in Britain maybe 100 years ago or so, the collective kind of value related to, let's say, homosexuality was that it was considered immoral, and there was kind of laws to prevent it. So collectively, there was that kind of agreed view that homosexuality was supposedly abhorrent, it was immoral. Now, that was maybe 100 plus years ago. That's not the moral view of our society now. So our value system has changed, right? So in essence, things that are part of our society, the values that underpin it, they might be collectively agreed, but they are susceptible to change. So the value that we give, the meaning, importantly, that we give to objects, to things, to ideas, can change based on different situations. So then the question then is, what creates change in meaning systems? How does change to our meaning system come about?
What we need, what purposes of them.
So based on perhaps our needs, which can be, again, situational. In different situations, we might need certain things. So what creates change then? Two types. Yeah, go on.
Enough people like getting the same belief in something, and then to share people to changes.
Okay. Yeah, so there could be two possible responses that are kind of change to the system. If there is something wrong and we collectively started to change our sense of value related to it, that we might petition to kind of get it changed. If we look at it, there's kind of gradual changes that can happen to our norms. So, you know, again, 100 plus years ago, I don't know, there was the trend or the belief that perhaps there were distinct gender roles, that women should stay at home, look after the children, nurture, while men go out and work. That's not the attitude that we have collectively as a society today. So that's changed. That's been eroded, and a new trend has emerged. That's gradual. Some changes to meaning system can happen rapidly. So those are usually attributed to crisis and shock. So think of the pandemic. That was a global crisis that shocked the very foundations of our society. How we behaved our social patterns radically changed due to things like lockdown. We had to change the way we behaved and interacted. We were cut off from our collective, and we were forced into changing our behavior. That can change a lot of our meaning systems, right? So things like Brexit is a crisis. You know, the crash of the stock market, where people lost everything overnight, can create a crisis, a shock, and that can change your meaning system. Now, how does society deal with shock and crisis? So how does a society deal with it? Yeah.
Together.
So we can rally together. So there are different responses that society has to shock and crisis. So if you're a tribe, like I said, and you wake up and your crops have been decimated, you are facing a life and death crisis. That shock, because the crops for that season have been destroyed. There's no way now you're going to replant and grow your crops. Your tribe will potentially die. That's a shock to the whole tribe. So how we deal with it collectively, well, yeah, you can have things like fear being generated, cynicism and doubt, but what we want to kind of look at is this issue of symbolism and the problem inherent within it. So we're obviously drawing to this understanding of how we create meaning, right? So what do we mean by the problem of symbolism?
Understanding of it.
Our understanding of it, right? So in essence, we use symbols in our society, in our social interactions. That could be words, gestures, objects. We give and imbue meaning. So if we say, hello, that word has symbolic value, right? It's a greeting that we have. If a smile has symbolic value, it's kind of like a friendship. In some societies, a smile is considered aggressive. So different symbolic value given. Now, in essence, and as well as objects, we give meaning to things, right? So like last week we talked about our early ancestors gave the cave the idea of sacredness. It was a sacred place. In modern society, perhaps churches are considered sacred. We give that value to those things, which brings us to what we covered in week 1, symbolic interactionism. Now, the problem with symbolism is, in essence, that our actions, our behavior, is dependent upon the meaning that we ascribe to it. Now, the problem with that is that we can have different meanings, and meanings can change. So bringing you back to the example of the tree, if you've got that one tree, the same object, but you've got two different people. One person goes to the tree, sits under it on a hot sunny day, and thinks the tree is good. Yeah? So his experience of that object and the meaning that he gives is this is good. Another person goes to that same tree, but is bitten by a lot of ants and has a negative experience of that same object and gives a different meaning to the tree, says it's bad. So it's the same object, but due to the fact that two different people had two different experiences, the meaning that is generated is different. Also, meanings can change. So for example, just say if it was one person who went and sat under the tree, and it's a hot day, really liked it, and said, wow, yeah, the tree is really good, I enjoy it on a hot day. But then goes back the next day and is bitten by ants, well, his meaning can change. So we can have meaning, but that meaning can be different to someone else. That meaning can change, right? So why are we talking about all of this? So it's fundamental in understanding the creation of the devil. Because the devil, as we know, and as we're going to discuss, is the personification of evil. Why did we need to personify evil? Why did we need to do that? Because we're facing, obviously, all these problems and crisis, and it was the meaning that we gave to the crops dying and illness. So what happens, importantly, at a time of crisis is two possible outcomes. So this brings us to, let's say, the dark gods theory. So when you encounter a crisis, a major crisis, a fundamental crisis to your life and death kind of situation, there are two responses. One potential response is the dark gods theory, which suggests at the time of crisis, you respond by going back and retreating to the core of your principles, your tradition, your religion, your ideas, because that is what gives you comfort. It's the core of your identity. So you retreat back to the traditional. The other would be that you perhaps go towards something new. So a good example of this is what happened in Japan. Basically, at this time in Japan, the native ideas of Shinto had started to erode, and Buddhism had come in, and it was growing in huge popularity. And what happened was Genghis Khan decided that he wanted to invade Japan. And obviously, as we know, Genghis Khan is a feared warrior who ravaged large parts of the world, conquered at will. He was feared across the globe. And when it was kind of declared that he wanted to conquer Japan, people in Japan were genuinely terrified because there was no way to stop this man and his army. And so he started to build a large naval armada, and that armada then set off towards Japan. So it's real. He's coming with his large armada to conquer Japan. So the Japanese people go to the Buddha and try to, help us. But there doesn't seem to be any kind of help there because it's all about enlightenment and all these other things. So the Japanese people started to think, okay, how did this island of Japan protect itself in the past? It was the unique native Japanese gods, the kami, that protected Japan. And in particular, the god Kamikaze, the god of the wind, he was a protector of the seas. So people started to venerate. What happened is when the armada of Genghis Khan was approaching, or halfway, it was hit by a huge typhoon that destroyed half of his navy, and he was forced to retreat back. So for the Japanese people, it was a kind of affirmation that their traditional gods were the true protectors of Japan, not the Buddha, but basically the Japanese gods, the kami. So in essence, they retreated back to their original beliefs when crisis came. So when you encounter a shock, a crisis, you can retreat back to your base principles because that's what perhaps gives you that kind of support. Or you change your ideas. Are there any questions so far? Okay, so this really brings us to the devil. So as we know, this character, the devil, has many names. He has many forms. He's been described in many different ways. He's been conceived of in many different ways. So, in essence, this devil is an important character to study, especially when it comes to this idea of symbolic value. Because I said, we give symbolic value to different things, right? So the smile, different gestures, different objects, we give these things value. So the cave was given symbolic value by our ancestors as a place of worship, as a place to access the supernatural. So the devil and its different forms has significant symbolic value. What is this perhaps symbolic value of the devil? Yep.
Anything tragic or evil.
So it becomes a source for essentially attributing bad things. So if there's illness, if there's a plague, if there's a crisis, then that devil entity represents the source of it. It is the source of all evil, right? So we give evil physicality. Now, why then have there been different forms for the devil? Why has the devil appeared in so many differing forms and manifestations?
Different cultures develop different meanings from that.
Okay, so different cultures represent evil in different ways based on the problems that they encounter. What else? Why is it that even if you look at the traditional devil character in the Abrahamic faiths, and we're going to explore this, the Satan character starts off very differently from his, modern manifestation. So if we think the devil now, when I think of the devil, I think, red, horns, pitchfork, hoof feet, all of that demonic kind of grotesque looking. But yet that's not his origin. His origin is radically different. He's the kind of supposed fallen angel. He was an accuser, a disciple of God. He was doing God's work in the Old Testament, which we're going to look at. So how could he go from a very kind of an angel working for God become so grotesque and the enemy of God? So all this kind of change of form is important. But ultimately, why or what the devil represents in terms of symbolic value is the human need to represent evil in physical form. So there has to be a source of everything bad that's happening. So when the Israelites were facing so much torment and trouble, there was a need to personify evil away from humans and, importantly, away from God. Because obviously God represents good and love, so he could not be the source of evil. Humans could not be the source of evil, and therefore we needed to represent evil in physical form. And this still happens to this day. So famously, after 9/11, George Bush declared that evil is real and it had to be fought. So what's the significance of that? So what George Bush was trying to do is to kind of create a duality, a conflict between good and evil. And he gave evil representation. Evil were the Taliban. Evil were Al-Qaeda. And these people were just evil, pure evil. And thus, by saying that they were evil and they were the manifestation of evil, you can go and bomb them back into the Stone Age, right? So it's basically used to personify evil. Okay, so this leads us to another really pivotal concept in understanding the creation of the devil, which is this whole idea of good and evil. Yeah. So we have this kind of idea of good and evil that's quite central to our understanding of the devil. So this duality, as we're going to find out, is very much kind of the archetype behind the good and bad, i.e. God versus the devil narrative. So why is it that we have this duality? So Kara says this world of ours is a world of opposites. There is good and evil, there is God and the devil. What does he mean that we create perhaps a world of opposites? So we kind of create dichotomies in the social world that we exist in, right? Now, the problem is that dualities are very problematic. So what is duality in its simplest sense? What is duality?
Two meanings.
Two meanings, right? So you've got really the presence of something and the absence of something. You could say the affirmation and negation, right? So duality is the presence of something and the absence of it. So let's look at examples. So take wealth. The presence of wealth is rich, right? So that is the person who has the presence of wealth, that's rich. The absence of wealth is poor, right? You could say in terms of day, the presence of light, and then you've got the absence of light, which is dark. Now the problem is, this is often seen as the ideal, the archetype, and this is seen as the opposition. So in essence, what duality does is it creates a world of dichotomy, that we create ideal archetypes and the opposite of those things, which naturally lead us to see them as often opposing or in conflict. So obviously, good and bad. Good is represented by the divine creator, and the devil is his sworn enemy, represents evil, right? So this creates this kind of duality that we kind of inherently try to apply to the social reality that we're embedded within. So what we need to do then is try to understand, and we are going to look at different aspects of how the Abrahamic tradition formed the idea of the devil and so forth. We are going to be looking at in detail. But first, what we want to do is make another really important point before we jump into the kind of development of evil deities in, let's say, the Abrahamic tradition. So the evil deity paradigm is really interesting because before the kind of arrival of the Abrahamic traditions, if we go back to the earliest expressions of religion, when we're talking about in tribal societies, hunter-gatherer societies, of course, these societies encountered major problems in nature. They encountered things like drought and illness. So these were major shocks to the tribe. Now, why didn't they respond by perhaps worshipping the destructive spirits or gods that caused the drought, that caused the fire, that caused the illness? Why is it perhaps that they didn't?
Because they were no good to them. They weren't of value to them.
Okay, so based on utility, they didn't provide maybe need. So if we look at it, we said before that early societies were monistic, which meant the relationship they had with nature was based on utility. So the god of the sun was important to a farmer. The sea god might be important to a fisherman. Now, what's important to understand is that during this kind of monistic conception, meaning early societies, there was no dichotomy between good and bad in nature. So there was no imbued kind of good and bad. Why? What does that mean, that there was no imbued kind of good and bad in nature?
Because people didn't understand the workings of nature.
Okay, so there was an element of lacking knowledge, but also what we see is that the early tribes never saw the sun as good or bad. They simply saw it as there was a controlling agent that controlled it, made it go up, made it go down. Yes, it had destructive power, but it had life-giving power. The God behind the sun was just giving it agency, was animating it. It was neither good or bad. In nature, there was no real good or bad. There was just the deities that controlled nature. If we look at a lot of the mythologies within the polytheistic religions, go from like Greek to Norse and others, there's very little instance of this kind of evil deity. So what we see is often the gods are neither good nor bad. They have a function. They have a job. They do that job. The god of the sea has his job. Hades, often sometimes in Greek mythology, is described as bad, right? That he's the lord of the underworld. Hades, yes, was the lord or god of the underworld, but he was also the god of justice. He was also the god of wealth. He was not inherently bad or evil. So the gods in nature just had a job of animating nature. Yeah, they gave life and made that living thing work. That was their job. So there was no dichotomy of good and evil. There was no imbuing nature with duality of good and bad. So good and bad and this idea of an evil deity or an evil character was not needed. There is no kind of evil in the early kind of tribal societies. Why then does this concept of evil deity come about when we formed settled societies? So we see that basically this idea of representing evil manifests more when we establish settled societies and civilizations. So the Egyptians to some degree have a kind of evil deity. They don't construct it in the same way as the Abrahamic, but we see other representations. So before settled society, no good and bad imbued in nature, no devil character, no evil deity. When we form settled societies, there seems to be devil characters or evil deities formed. Why?
As a punishment for order in society.
So possibly to create order in society, to basically provide some kind of moral alignment.
I suppose people want to contribute to society more, so when they're not able to due to any reason, then they need something to blame almost.
So our need changes when we go from hunter-gatherer to settled society. We have different needs, and perhaps there is a need collectively to represent evil. But it's interesting that this concept really starts to evolve when we go into these kind of settled societies. So Melon Nowinski tries to explain why evil starts about. So you've got that kind of early tribal society, and then we go to this kind of settled society, right? Now, even in tribal societies, Melon Nowinski said there was evidence that these tribal societies began to accommodate evil with good. Not necessarily saying the natural world was good and bad, i.e. duality, of a moral duality, but they started to accommodate evil with good. How did they accommodate evil with good? Any ideas on how that came about? So for the tribe that he explored in Papua New Guinea, he said the tribe believed in this thing called Lililu, which was basically like a supernatural place. Might consider it the origin of magic. It's this kind of supernatural place. It's kind of the supernatural place that exists kind of beyond the cave. It's that supernatural reality, if you will. Now, that supernatural place has a bridge to the living world, to the real world. Now, that bridge has been created so that we, as humans, can harness the power of the supernatural and manipulate nature. I.e., we want to use magic, right? So, in essence, this bridge is used to benefit humans through magic to manipulate nature. But the tribe believe that when you open that door to the supernatural, the Tukaway come out. So these are kind of destructive spirits. These are spirits that can cause illness. These are spirits that can cause, famine. So what happens is, because of human contact with the supernatural, that's what creates kind of evil. So they're not saying that there is an evil God. They're not saying necessarily the Tukaway are inherently evil. But what happens is, because humans try to manipulate nature through the use of the supernatural, evil spirits can be released. And these spirits can be kind of attributed to why bad things happen. So there is an element of needing, even here, that basically understanding, i.e., because look, what did we say religion really was about in the tribal society? Yes, utility, but obviously as well, meaning. There was a need to kind of create meaning. So if the world is going kind of bad, you have crisis, you have death of your crops, these types of things, there's need to give it meaning as well, an explanation. So there is an element of what he suggests is that some tribes accommodate evil with good. They didn't say it was an evil deity, but they were trying to accommodate the natural world with evil, if that makes sense. Okay. So eventually we will get probably the next lecture into the details of the devil. But it's important, before we go to the Abrahamic, to look at ancient Egypt and see instances of the formation of evil deities. Because Christianity or the Abrahamic traditions, are not the only religious system that has this kind of evil character. Other mythologies had elements of evil characters. So if we look at the ancient Egyptians, we have the deity Set who is considered the evil deity. Now, if we look at the origin of it, actually Set began as a desert god. He was not good or bad. He was just the god of the desert that protected people. And he was worshipped by the Upper Egyptians. So how could Set, who was actually the god of the desert, worshipped, become an evil deity? How does that come about?
Because the desert's arid. The sun.
Okay, yeah, go on.
I would have thought because the desert produces nothing.
Okay, so but ultimately, so he was, yes, the god of the desert, but he was considered like a good god by those people. What happens is, in Lower Egypt, they worshipped the god Horus. Now, around 3000 BC, what happens is Lower Egypt conquers Upper Egypt. And so, in essence, they then vilify Set. So basically, Lower Egypt conquers Upper Egypt, it becomes a unified Egypt, and what happens is the god that they worshipped is vilified as evil. And now, how they do that is through then mythology. So, what happens basically is when you have this process of unification, i.e. Lower Egypt conquering Upper, basically this is represented as a battle between the two gods, Horus and Set. And they engage in all these different competitions, and Horus basically wins all of them, and Set is angered, and he tries to basically have like sexual intercourse with Horus, who blocks it, and then they have, it's a bit of a weird one, they have a final boat race, and Horus builds his boat out of wood, Set builds his boat out of stone. Cutting a very long story short, Horus wins, and Set is vanquished. Set is defeated. But he's not destroyed or killed by Horus. Why? It would make him evil, but why not destroy Set? Why keep him around? Why keep him alive? Yeah.
He still has utility as an explanation for evil.
Exactly. So in essence, what's going to happen in a couple of weeks if you kill Set and the crops die? What happens if there's a famine? You still need to manifest evil. You need to show that, okay, basically it's all because of Set. He is this evil deity that causes all the problems in Egypt. It's not Horus, he's good. So you're basically giving evil personification, and you need that to justify to your people why the bad things are happening. So in many ways, it's a tool of coercing people to basically get them to conform or get them to kind of represent the evil that they encounter. We'll leave it there, and we'll talk about the devil in the Abrahamic traditions on Thursday.